Today, there's so much in our lives that influences us, our environment, the people around us. Sometimes we don't even know what's influencing us, and that's what we're here to talk about. Welcome to the Influence Today podcast with Chet Tart and Terry Lyle.
Welcome to another podcast of Influence Today with Chet Tart and Terry Lyles. Hi, Terry.
Hey, good to be back.
I'm glad you're back. And topics have been about who influenced you and how the environment influenced you and how different people have influenced you. And the last couple have been great. We're talking about coaches and about how great coaches have influenced each other. Today we have a guest, Bob Goldfarb. And Bob has a very interesting story, and he talks about influences. And Terry and I are going to talk to you today about how you were influenced from growing up to where you grew up and how you moved all over the country and how that influenced you also. Right. And about taking chances. And today, if you are a millennial or you're somebody in your 30s and 40s and there's issues in your life, you might want to pay attention closely to these stories because, as I said, there's always a way. There's always a way. Would you agree with that, Bob?
I totally agree. And Chet and Terry, I thank you for having me here today. I appreciate it.
Great. Well, Bob, tell us a little bit about who you are. You're a very interesting person. And I want to go back a little bit and talk about influences. And before we started, we talked about influence. And I keep saying that the people around you is scary because they really have an influence on you, whether positive or negative.
And sometimes directly and indirectly.
That's correct.
So it depends on your experiences in life, who you get to meet in your life, and the chances of meeting some really influential people that could influence you one way or the other. Mm-hmm. So I will first start off by suggesting I had a very negative influence when I was a kid. My father was not the greatest role model. He was an unambitious postal clerk that worked for the United States Post Office for 35 years on the night shift. He would leave the house at 10:30 at night and work downtown Manhattan from 11 to 8 every day. Then he would come home and sleep. And then when he'd get up, he would either go to the track, Aqueduct or Belmont, and bet the horses, and eventually he became a bookie. And as a bookie, I saw money flow in, flow out. It was an amazing thing to see. And then my father became the worst kind of bookie, one that bet. Mm-hmm. So when you start betting as well as taking bets, you end up on the losing side of that. So his influences were very negative for me. Mm-hmm. And we were struggling. We lived in a three-room apartment, in the Bronx. I slept in the living room. I didn't have my own room.
Did you have brothers and sisters?
I'm an only child.
Okay.
My mother worked. She was a full-charge bookkeeper. And, eventually when I was 16, we did move across the street, and I had an apartment where I did have my own room. But he was never really there, for me. Neither of them really cared about academically what I was doing. So I was, a wise guy kid, and I did what I wanted to do, and I came and went as I could, and did some foolish things when I was younger, and did a lot of experimenting, but I always found a way to work. I started working when I was 13, delivering the New York Post in the neighborhood, and it was easy in the neighborhood because you just go up and down elevators in the building. But still, it was, it was a job. And then I ended up working in this place called Angie's, which is a coffee shop, little candy store on the corner of my neighborhood. And at first I was making egg creams and sodas and malteds. And then eventually I was slinging burgers and making sandwiches. And, so
Who was directing you to do all this? How did you just decide I'm going to do a paper route? I'm going to work in Angie's?
Because I didn't have any money.
And your parents didn't give you any?
No. Mm-hmm. So I decided, well, I got to find a way. And then, of course, you have friends, and some of them are older, and they say, hey, you should get a paper route. And so a paper route came available in my neighborhood, so I applied for it, and I got it. And then as far as Angie's, there was a lot of my friends that actually had passed through Angie's over the years. And it was, it was just a local haunt where you'd have a probably 8-seat counter and probably 4 or 5 booths where people could sit, and you just took care of the people in the neighborhood. It was very cozy neighborhood. It was called Pelham Parkway in the Bronx.
Yeah.
And it was kind of what we call a Jewish shtetl, in that it was 99% Jewish. And but it was all people of the relative income bracket. So we were all kind of like the same people. We all grew up the same way, and we all grew up with that kind of like survival instinct, where you got to find a way just to get past the next day, because it was a dog eat dog kind of thing. And so I learned kind of on my own, because like I said, my dad wasn't really around much and my mom was working. She was a wonderful woman, but kind of subservient and just motivated to make sure that my father was okay and that I was okay, and that was her sole motivation.
Yeah,
back then.
so those
and that was
hard,
in the '60s,
Yeah, so those hard times, like in all of our lives, I mean, it builds character, and
Right.
it teaches you to survive and fight and scrap and get through things. And I mean, that's in my life, and I know, Chet, I know enough about your life to be dangerous, but I know that that's how you do it. We've all had probably 25, 30 careers in our lives.
So
they weren't really careers,
Right.
but they
You
were
grew up in
job opportunities.
Detroit, right?
No, I grew up in Indianapolis,
Oh,
but I spent a
Indianapolis.
decade in
You got
Detroit. Yeah.
And you grew up in New York.
Bronx.
In New York.
These are competitive cities.
Oh, yeah.
The
Right.
environment itself makes you competitive, right?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, it was. Everything was competitive because there's just so many people.
Sure.
There was 50,000 people. 50,000 people in a 1 square mile area.
Yeah.
It was all apartment buildings.
Yeah.
Right.
So, like when we would hang out at night, my friends and I, when we were 16, 17 years old, we used to hang out at this Carvel on the corner. I would swear there would be 80 to 100 kids
Sure.
just hanging out. When I got a car, and which I paid for by myself by working, I had to park my car 5 blocks from my house to find a parking spot because it's so impossible. Yet I would go get my car to drive 1 block from my house, double park my car so I could have my car there while I was hanging out with all my friends. So it was that kind of
So we
environment.
did what we needed to do to survive.
Well, and I think that's, you started off the show talking about, the age divide today, and so many younger people are growing up today with an entitlement mentality. My background is psychology, so you watch human behavior and you get a reasonable deduction on their thought process. And when people are constantly just thinking that, you owe me and you've got to hire me because I went to school.
So Terry, how did that happen?
It's what we consider soft shell conditioning. You grow up in an environment that protects you versus throwing you out there and go figure it out to some degree, not completely, but like you're sharing, Bob, and like I've done and you've done, Chet. I mean, at some point you have to go out there and get it.
Right.
I mean, I started working at 14 as well. Flipping burgers. I mean, you do what you have to do because I needed a car.
Right.
It's all about purpose.
Right.
Right.
Like you said,
Exactly.
you would walk, all the way across town to drive your car double pocket 1 block because you needed your car there.
Right.
Because that means you're somebody.
Because that meant
you
I
accomplished
had
something.
accomplished something.
Exactly. And that's important.
And knowing that I paid for that car.
Absolutely.
What was
Absolutely.
it? What was the
It
car?
it was a Pontiac Catalina.
Nice.
428 4-barrel.
And
How much?
Bench seat. I
Back
paid,
then.
Paid,
Used?
I paid, I think, $1,000 for it.
Wow. Yeah.
That
That was a lot of
though.
money.
Yeah, it was a lot of money. A whole
But
lot of hard
gas,
work.
but gas was 19 cents a gallon.
I remember
Sure.
that. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I had this big V8 4-barrel that would just eat gas like crazy, but Didn't matter.
You look good and you sound
I
good,
look good.
you know?
And I would pile, and there was this great place to go. Nathan's had
Sure.
had an installation up in Yonkers, and I would pile as many people as I could in my car, and I'm serious, not 7.
Sure.
I'm talking about 9, 10 people.
Yeah, it was
And
before
we would-
seatbelts anyway, so it didn't matter. You
Didn't
just put
care.
'em in.
And we drove up to Nathan's, and we had our ice cream and hot dogs, and then we
Sure.
went home.
Right.
You know, and I was one of the oldest in the group, so I was one of the first ones to have a car.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, you're kind of like king of the road, you know.
Right.
What
Because,
great memories, though.
you know.
Great.
Well, and see, and again, I think what culture has begun to lose pretty rapidly because of, I blame a lot on technology because
Sure.
it's, you know, you've gone from Yonkers and the Bronx, and I went from Indianapolis and, you know, Ohio.
You
and
have no idea. where
You've
I've
been all over the place.
I've
So,
been
you know,
48 states.
right.
I've lived
Yeah,
in
you've lived
17 of
everywhere.
them.
Yeah. So now we live in a global community.
Sure.
And it's all virtual.
Right.
I mean, look, we're doing this virtually right
Right.
now. I mean, this interview. We're not on radio. We're not on television. We're doing this, and it's virtual because that's the world we live in. That's great. But what it does do is it builds a divide between people, and a lot of those inherent people skills that we grew up with because you had to interact with people and you'd, hey, what's up? And we didn't call people to say, you're going to meet me at Nathan's. You know, you went there that day and that time. And you see, we don't live in that world now, and it's confusing. So
is.
you look at some younger people today, and I'm not being condescending at all. I mean, I've got kids, you know, almost my age, basically. You know what I mean? So they live in a different world than I did, and it's hard to even have those kind of. They look at you like, you did what? Because they're like, I didn't have to do that. No, because I afforded it to you. So you didn't have to do that, right, wrong, or indifferent.
Right.
So we just live in a different world of, as we matriculate through life, you know, we've become this conversation that is interesting to people because they look at it and go, why did you do that?
But there's a basic we're talking about here. As we move forward with Bob's life, I think it's important to understand that you have to survive, okay? What the purpose was to get a car at the time. Now Bob goes through life. You want to tell us about that because it can happen in today's generation.
Sure.
And then we want to talk about the walls we hit future in life and how we deal with them because I don't care what generation you're talking about, this will happen.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
So let's talk about, as you go along, you went to college. What happened after that?
So I went to college. I really wasn't a student. I went to college to hang out in the square and get high. And that was the most important thing to me. And after a while, I realized
That's
You lived
really
in-
the
you lived-
influence.
You lived in the right era,
Right.
you know, to do that.
Right.
Yeah, because that's what everybody was doing.
right. So I was part of that generation, the 60s, late 60s, early 70s generation. And so on the side, a friend, another influencer, I guess I should call him in my life, came along and said, hey, you know, I'm doing some work for the Democrats. You know, we go around and we support candidates and we do things, we hang signs and stuff. Are you interested in doing that? And I said, sure. So this guy, Murray LeWinter, who was the county Democratic leader in my area, district leader, so I did some work for him on campaigns. So I got involved in politics all of a sudden. And then I was introduced to Pat Cunningham, who was the Bronx Democratic leader. Now, in New York City, the Bronx Democratic leader has as much power as about the mayor, as far as influence goes. So while I was there, during one of the elections, I was asked if I wanted to work for the elections board as a patronage job. I said, sure. Oh, I'd love to have a job. So I was 18 years old. You know, I said, I'll take that. So I was basically doing vote counting and stuff like that for the elections board, making sure the election thing was all set up and ready to go because it was that at that
You
time.
want a job
it was
at
not
that
just,
today?
Yeah, really. You
Right.
could use it in West Palm Beach,
Exactly.
that's for sure. And so from that, I got the elections job. Then when I was floundering around working in restaurants and just trying to stay afloat, basically, after the elections job, I again got a call saying, hey, you know, the taxi industry is now regulated by the police department in New York City, and they want to break it up because there's too much crime and they want the police to concentrate on crime. So they're forming the Taxi and Limousine Commission. So I have a job for you at the Taxi and Limousine Commission as an officer. I said, okay, what do I do? Just go down to personnel and tell them you're here for that. And so I became a officer for the Taxi and Limousine Commission, going around giving taxi cab drivers tickets for 100 different things that they could do wrong.
Of course. Yeah.
So again, that was a Pat Cunningham influential job. Basically you walk in, patronage job's real easy. Hi, I'm Bob. I'm here for the interview. Sign here. Goodbye. You start Monday. That's how the job worked. Anyway, so we were regulating taxis, and all of a sudden they want to regulate the gypsy taxi industry. And to make a very long story short, we did that until one day I walked into a gypsy cab service and I had a 12 gauge in my head for a guy that said, no, you don't belong here. And I said, I think I came to the wrong place. Walked out, brought back the police. We
Need
busted
a new
them.
job. Yeah.
And then the next day I quit.
Yeah.
And I went back to Pat and I said, that was a great experience, but, I'd like something a little tamer.
I didn't want that to be my last experience, so I'm going to move on.
So on my last political patronage job, I was given the job of being a manager of an off-track betting parlor in New York City because OTB was I went back to my father, I guess, right?
Yeah, sure. We all do.
And OTB was very big in gambling. In fact, my father used to hang out at OTB. Everybody knew him there. And
Did they know you?
No.
Because you had the same last name.
Yeah, nah. Because he literally hung out there. So that was our last patronage job. And then a friend of mine said, I'm moving to California. We have some friends out there that we grew up in the Bronx. And, we're going to go visit them and, go hang out and see what it's like. And I said, okay. Mm-hmm. So I got in her Volkswagen Beetle with her dog, and we drove cross country and settled in California. And I needed a job, and what do I know? And I had to do a restaurant business, so I went to restaurants. And what happened was this judge, Steve Zarkin in Bronx, had a cousin named Lori in California who had a Chicago pizza restaurant. And Zarkin said, go see my cousin, he'll give you a job. So I get the job at the pizza. It's called Chicago Pizza Works. I'm a cook, and then the guy decides he wants to open up another restaurant. I did a good job, so he makes me manager of the new restaurant. And one of the great experiences I had, I have to tell you this, was Billy Crystal, Rob Reiner, and Penny Marshall come in for a pizza one day. It was the best.
Were they famous at the time?
Oh, yeah, but they were young.
Yeah.
Billy Crystal was on Soap.
Yes.
Reiner was on Archie Bunker, stuff like that. And it was like, that was the greatest experience of my life. Anyway, one of the gals who worked for me as a hostess said to me, there's bigger restaurants you could work at. You can get more money and blah, blah. So I went and interviewed with some other restaurant company. I got the job there. And then I was working for this company called Far West Services. And then 2 years after that, I got sick. I had hepatitis. And they basically said, we don't know if we want you back at the restaurant. You got, some sort of contagious, blah, blah, blah. So I ended up interviewing for Victoria Station and opened up a new Victoria Station in Yonkers. So I had to go back to New York. And I said, I go back to New York for 1 year, but after that I have to go back to California. And they said, great, we'll do that. We'll sign off on that. No problem. Year comes, did a great job at the restaurant. I'm ready to go back to California. We don't have a spot for you. I said, I gave you 1 year. I need a spot today. I don't have a spot for you. I said, thank you very much. Goodbye. I left, went back to California, walked into a headhunting firm, Dunhill and Associates, Frank Morris. And I go to Frank. I said, Frank, here's my great resume. I managed $3 million restaurants. I'm really good at that. Can you find me a job? He says, I don't have a job, but I have an empty desk over there. Would you like to be a headhunter?
And you said yes.
And I said yes, and from that was 25 years.
Yeah, let me stop you a second. We're talking about Bob Goldfarb. Was it this easy to get jobs all the time? Because it sounds like anytime you wanted to quit or change, it was like this. And in today's environment, I hear how tough it is.
Well, I had a decent level of confidence in myself, which was one thing.
Okay, let's pick them out. Confidence.
I definitely had confidence. I was committed. So whenever I went into something, I was very committed. When I did something, I was successful at it, and I had something to speak about. And the thing about speaking about is I knew how to sell myself well, which was the most important thing.
So, critically important, don't you think, Terry?
Absolutely.
For anyone listening.
Yeah. Yeah, the challenge today, and I keep coming back to today because, I hear a lot of these stories. You can't even get to an interview today. I mean, you have to go through a hiring system on the internet. You don't see a person. You send in your information. If they it's like a lotto. If they contact you back,
right,
then you might get an interview. See, back in the day, we used to walk in and I could sell that person.
Right.
I'd walk in. I'm confident. I can dress. I can talk. I'd get that job today. Walk out. You can't get there
now
today.
They give you a test.
Right. So there's a different
if you
set
can get
of,
to the point.
if you can get there. So I think this is why this is interesting, because we're talking about the way things were. But when you look at the way things are now, I mean, it's all driven through the internet. And it's just a different space.
But back then, and if you heard, there was a common theme through all these things,
Yep.
in that in most cases, there was somebody that was guiding
It was a
me.
network.
There was some sort of influencer or person who was guiding me to the next step.
Mm-hmm.
And
Influence.
And that's
There
what it
goes.
takes.
Pay
It's
attention.
all networking.
and then I had to make choices whether I wanted to take these opportunities that came in front of me.
Right.
A lot of people today, in the past, I don't care when it was, are scared to take chances.
Sure.
They don't want to step out of their safety box. They don't put their toes in the water, however you want to talk about it. I never had fear of that. I always thought, if somebody presents me with a great opportunity that sounds good to me, I'm going to go for it. I'm going to give it a shot, because
We did a whole
nothing
series on fear like that.
Right.
Yeah.
So here's what we're going to do. This is normally the end, but you have an interesting story that continues to go on, and I want to talk about how you continued, and then to all of us, we ran into the 90s and 2000s and things stopped. And I want to know about your self-talk. I want to know about...
Well, interesting that you say that. The 90s up through 2001 were the highlights of my life.
Okay, we'll talk about that. Would you come back with us next week?
Absolutely, I'd love to.
Thank you. You've been listening to Influence Today. We're broadcasting live from Venture X at Palm Beach Gardens. Our guest has been Bob Goldfarb and Terry Lyles. And if you want to get in touch with Terry Lyles, your email address, or no, not your what's it called? Website.
Yeah.
I knew it
The
was
whole
called-
technology thing is just myname.com. Terry Lyles, TerryLyles.com.
Right, and he'll be willing to help you out. And I'm Chet at intentional-influence.com. We'll catch you back next week, and Bob will be back next week also.